for joining our next Gen STEM week this week. We have a soil ecologist, Dr. Yamina Pressler, joining us today. Yamina, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about soil and why it is so important to study?
Soil is the living, breathing skin of the earth. That's what I always like to say to my students. It is alive, and it is this natural wonder that is full of minerals and organic matter and air and water and organisms that are all interacting together at the surface of the earth to create this little ecosystem that underlies everything that we see out in nature. And so I have become really obsessed with soil in my time being a soil scientist. And I think it's so important to study for two reasons. One, because it's incredibly interesting and complex and dynamic. But the other main reason is that it supports all of these important ecosystem services. So without soil, of course, we can't grow food. Without soil, we wouldn't be able to filter fresh water and regulate the amount of water that's in ecosystems. Soils are important for regulating our climate. Soils help provide for the above ground biodiversity, so all the plants and animals, trees, and all of that stuff. And so really soils are tied to almost everything that we do as soon as we stop to think about it. So they're incredibly important, and they're also incredibly interesting and fun to study because they're like a big puzzle out in nature.
Oh, definitely. I love that. So what got you into studying soil, and what was your college experience like?
So I had a really great college experience. I did my undergrad at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is the same place that I am sitting here now as an educator and a soil scientist. And so for me, when I went to college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, as many college students do. I decided to study environmental management because I knew that I liked being outside. I knew that I had a connection to nature and I wanted to kind of protect it and preserve it. But I didn't really know what kind of jobs there were. And I remember when I told my dad that I wanted to become a soil scientist, he was like, wait, that's a job? You can do that? So I had no idea. And really what it took was taking an introductory soils class that was part of my curriculum. And I just fell in love with it. It was one of those things that I had no idea that soils were so many different colors and that there were so many different kinds of organisms that live in soil. And it just completely blew my mind. It was something that I had never thought about before. And so I took that class and I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. I'm having a fun time in this class. Maybe I'll take a few others. And it just kind of spiraled from there. And by the time I got to the end of my undergraduate experience, I decided I'm not done learning about soil. I want to keep learning about it. And of course, we do learning in all kinds of parts of our life, not just in school, but I really felt like I wanted to keep going in my soils education. And so I went off and did a PhD at Colorado State, and the rest is just being a soil scientist, a place I never expected to be.
Yeah, that's great. And what do you do as a soil scientist, and what you already talked about what inspired you to become one. So what does your job look like? I know today, our culture's a little bit different, our daily lives look a little different, but what does yours usually look like?
So in a typical day, a lot of my job consists around teaching and also doing research in a university setting. And so for me, on a typical non-COVID day, I would come to campus, ride my pink Vespa up to campus, come into my office. I usually get in pretty early because I'm a morning person, and I will sit down and write for a couple of hours. Writing anything from manuscripts or papers about research that I'm doing, or more blog posts or things about soil. And so I'll spend a couple of hours doing that. And then I usually spend time preparing for my class. So that involves a lot of reading about soil and thinking about soil. And then I go and I meet with my students and I get to talk about soil. And
Nice.
It's awesome. So, but one of the best part of my job is one of the things that I love so much is the fact that almost every single day I get to take students out into the field. So on a field trip. So we'll go anywhere from a soil pit, which is basically a hole in the ground, out that we have on campus that we use for teaching and research purposes. So we'll do something like that, or sometimes we'll go out to another local ecosystem. Like, for example, we have a lot of coastal dune soils here in San Luis Obispo, so I'll take students out on a trip to do that, and it's really fun because we literally get our hands dirty studying and learning about soil with my colleagues and with my students almost every day. So it's a lot of fun.
That does sound fun. Love it. So do you, what are, or I guess, sorry, what are other paths someone could take if they were wanting to become a soil scientist?
Yeah, that's a really great question because I think, for many of us, like I didn't know a soil scientist before I became one, right? Or before I met a soil scientist when I was an undergraduate. And so I think that a lot of people have a perception that all soil scientists work in agricultural systems. And many of us do. I have some research sites that are in agricultural systems, but a lot of soil scientists work outside in all kinds of different areas of the world and all kinds of different ecosystems. So there are many soil scientists who will work in forests and deserts and wetlands and aren't necessarily working in ag systems. And so because of that, you can find soil scientists in all kinds of different swaths of the working world. So many of us are in academia, we continue to teach. Many of us work in different government agencies, so you could work for the USDA or the USGS, different government agencies that do research and management of soils. People will work out in industry, people will work in the nonprofit sector, people will work at museums. I mean, there's all kinds of jobs that you could pursue once you're a soil scientist because soils are everywhere. And like I said earlier, we rely on soils for almost everything. And so soil scientists are, there's kind of an unimaginable amount of opportunity, I think, in this field.
Awesome. That's so much fun. And do you work with I know you teach some classes, but in your department or in your daily job, do you work by yourself or with a team?
That's a good one. I would say both. A lot of times I am spending time working by myself if I'm preparing for my lectures, for example. But a lot of my work is very collaborative. So I am lucky to be in a department that has lots of other soil scientists here. So we work together, but we also work with other scientists and researchers who do and study different things. So people who study plants and people who study the ocean and the atmosphere and freshwater systems and people who study social ecological systems. And so the range of different kinds of scientists and researchers that I work with is really broad. And that's both here at my home institution, but I also collaborate with people at lots of other institutions all over the US and all over the world. So I would say a little bit of both. Sometimes you're writing and thinking about soil alone. Sometimes I'm working with students and sometimes I'm working with my other colleagues.
Awesome. And you even kind of talked a little bit about our next question. So where does one study soil and where in the world have you gone to study soil?
Yeah, so soil is absolutely everywhere, right? And that means that as a soil scientist, you can go all over the place to study soil. And so some of my most memorable experiences out in the field and out doing research as a soil scientist have been up in the Arctic tundra in northern Alaska. There, I had the opportunity to go up there for the last several years to study how the organisms that live within soils up in that ecosystem are responding to environmental change, so climate change and fire and things like that. And so that was really fun because those soils are completely different than what we see here in California. But I've also been able to go to all kinds of places in the US. So I had some sites in Oklahoma in a beautiful oak pine savanna. I had some sites in western Texas that was a little more semi-arid and dry, and also some sites in the forest in Colorado. So it takes me a little bit everywhere. But one of the cool things about being a soil scientist is, yes, you often travel to go study different soils around the world, but also the soils in your local ecosystem, in your local environment, are right there ready for you to study. So a lot of my research and teaching happens right here on Cal Poly's campus and right here in San Luis Obispo because there's soils everywhere. So I often don't have to go that far.
Awesome. That's so much fun. And so when you're out on the field, how do you collect a soil sample?
Ooh, oh, it's so fun. There's a couple of different ways that you can collect a soil sample. There's two, I would say, most common approaches. One is by using a core, and I don't actually have one here in my office, but it's basically, it kind of looks like a big apple core, if you imagine, where you push it down into the ground and you pull the soil up, and it's like this nice little skinny core. And so that's really useful. We use that a lot. But another thing that soil scientists often do is dig a hole in the ground, and like I said, we call it a soil pit. So it's a big hole in the ground. We go as deep as we can, usually at least a meter or so. And when you do that, you reveal the beauty that is the soil. So what happens when you dig a hole is you start to see these beautiful layers within the soil. We call those layers horizons. And soil scientists will take samples with a knife or a shovel from those different layers or from those different horizons, and then bring them back into the lab and study them that way. So sometimes we dig a big hole and we take the soil that way, and other times we just go from up above. And it really just depends on what you're studying, and also if you have access to be able to dig a huge hole like that. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It really just depends.
Oh, definitely. All right. So then you take your soil sample and you go back to the lab. What is your process when you study it back in your lab?
There are so many different things that you can do with soil once you bring it back into the lab. For me, I am a soil ecologist, which means that I study the organisms that live within the soil, what they do, how they're interacting with each other, and how they're interacting with the soil environment. So for me, my primary goal is to be able to observe and look at and quantify the organisms that live within a soil sample. So I might use some different extraction techniques to get those organisms out of the soil, and then I'll look at them under a microscope to be able to figure out how many are in there. And I actually have a microscope right here. I'm on my phone, so I'm mobile. There's a microscope right there, right in my office. So I spend a lot of time looking at different organisms underneath a microscope that live in the soil.
Very cool. Is there a specific type of soil that or environment that you study most, or I guess that you could come across in your region?
Yeah, so soils are really diverse across space. So when you go out into the field, you can find lots of different kinds of soil. And so I'm often working across many different types of soils that have all kinds of different physical, chemical, and biological properties. But most of my work has focused on soils that have been burned in a fire. So often I'll be going out after a fire and collecting soil samples. And so the type of soil can vary a lot, but the thing that is similar between all of them is that they've been recently burned. So that's a main one. But also here in San Luis Obispo, I live close to the coast, so I like to go out and think about those coastal soils as well.
Awesome. All right. So you talked about how soil is living and has microorganisms in there. Do you have
Yeah.
a favorite?
Oh, that's such a hard question. The reason I say that's hard is because a lot of my research studies soil food webs. So I'm interested in all of the different organisms that live within the soil and who eats whom. So how are they interacting within a food web? And so it's hard for me to pick a favorite, but I think if I had to pick a favorite, I would probably have to pick the tardigrade, which for many people is actually also their favorite soil organism. They're also known as the moss piglet or the water bear, and they are just absolutely adorable. And you can find them in all kinds of different soils and also in little mosses, and they kind of swim around like this. They look like a little bear. They're so cute, and I just love them.
Yeah. They are very cute. One of the things that we talked about in our workbook this week are nematodes. Can you describe what they are, and how do you see those often?
Yes, nematodes are everywhere. We find them in almost every soil. They are what we call ubiquitous. They're all over the world. And so nematodes are these tiny microscopic worm-like animals that live in the water spaces of soil. So they swim around within water films within the soil, and we can extract them or take them out of the soil and look at them under the microscope. So I actually do spend a lot of time looking at nematodes swimming around in a dish under the microscope. And what's fun about nematodes is they're very diverse. So they have lots of different forms and functions. Nematodes will eat everything from bacteria to fungi to even other nematodes, and they're really an integral part of the soil food web.
Very cool. All right. So looking back in your career and educational journey, what was the first project that you worked on that you were most proud of?
This question brings me a lot of joy, because thinking about my early time as an undergraduate, learning about soil was really empowering to me. And one of my first projects was with my advisor at the time, Dr. Karen Vaughn, who is a good friend and collaborator of mine. And we worked together on my senior project. So I had to do sort of a final project when I was an undergrad. And the premise of that work was to understand biological soil crusts and how they respond to different moisture environments. And so this was the first time I had really done an experiment on my own. And biological soil crusts are so fun and interesting because they're these little communities of different microorganisms, so lichen and bacteria and fungi, living all together at the surface of the soil. And they occur a lot in desert ecosystems. So if you go out into a desert or a semi-arid system, you'll kind of see them in between different shrubs or different plants. And they create this nice crust or surface layer on the soil, this living crust on the surface. And they're really important for lots of different things. They bring nitrogen into the soil. They're important for stabilizing the soil against wind and water erosion. They help water infiltrate down into the soil. And so they're really fun, unique community that I studied first off. And you know, I've always wanted to go back to studying biological soil crusts in the years since, because they have a really special place in my heart. And every time I talk about them in class to my students, I'm like, oh, I got to tell you about that first project. And yeah, so that would be the one I'm most proud of, because it really was the first soil ecology project that I did early on. And so I look back on it really fondly.
Oh, very cool. Uh, so how do you find ways to be creative in your job?
Ooh, science is actually inherently really creative. I think that sometimes we don't see science as a creative endeavor, but actually building new knowledge is the most creative thing that you can do, right? You're learning and creating new knowledge out of what we hadn't known in the past. And so I actually think that the process of science is really creative. So when we are designing an experiment or figuring out where we should go sample soils, that takes a lot of creativity to figure out what works best. But beyond the actual practices of science, I do a lot of other creative things that I enjoy. For one, I like to paint soil profiles, and I actually have a bunch of paintings up here. I'll show you one. Let's see if I can get this. So this is a little painting of a soil. Can you see it?
Yes, very fun.
So I will paint soils in my spare time with watercolors and things like that. And I also spend a lot of time writing about soil, and writing is, of course, a very creative practice. And I'm not always just writing sort of scientific technical papers, but I also write a lot about how whimsical and wonderful soils really are. So I think that's really creative as well. And so those are a couple of examples of my favorite kind of creative soil-related activities.
Oh, very fun. I love that. So you had mentioned a little bit before on that you use a microscope. What other technology do you use, and what kind of microscope do you use?
So we will use lots of different microscopes depending on the size of the organism, right? So soil organisms exist across this really wide range of scales. So most of them are microscopic, right? At least the microorganisms, although you could think of things like worms or voles or burrowing owls as being kind of the macroscopic organisms that live in the soil. But even when it comes to the microscopic organisms, we use lots of different microscopes that have different magnification power to be able to see them. So it really kind of just depends. But as far as other kind of favorite tools to the trade, I think the most classic tool for a soil scientist is a shovel, like this one right here.
Very nice.
This is my mini shovel. It even has a bunch of soil already on it. So for me, when I think about what are the tools that we use, something even as simple as a shovel and getting out there and getting your hands dirty and being able to figure out the color and the texture and the structure of the soil is a big part of what I do. So it doesn't have to be complex to be able to understand soils. It can actually be really simple, but that simple understanding can be really powerful.
Awesome. So you had mentioned a little bit before that you are a college professor. What led you into that journey of teaching others about soil?
Yeah, so I had some really amazing college professors, and I feel so lucky that those professors are still in my life, many of them, and they have continued to be mentors and advocates of mine as I've gone forward. And so, for me, it really took my college professors saying, "Hey, Yamina, you seem really interested in soil. Have you thought about making a career out of this?" Because I had no idea that that was a thing, right? And so they were really influential in helping me choose this career. And I have found that I feel so lucky to be able to be that person for my students now, to show them kind of the wonder and the beauty and the complexity of soils every single day and share my enthusiasm for soils. I often think that soils deserve celebrating. And I want to be that person, the one that celebrates soils here and in the classroom. And so for me, being a professor at a university is kind of the perfect fit, because I get to spend a lot of time thinking about, reading about, writing about, and talking about soils, while also kind of inspiring the next generation of soil scientists, because I see soils as extremely important and I want the field to continue forward.
Awesome. And what is a way that, those of us that aren't necessarily in soil science, what's a way that we can celebrate soil?
Oh, I love that question. What I often say is that soils are everywhere. And because of that, they often fade into the background. And so in our daily life, we may not notice them. I think the best way that you can celebrate soil is take some time out in your local environment, wherever it is, and just look at and interact with the soils in your natural environment. So maybe that's going on a hike and noticing the different colors of soil beneath your feet. Maybe that's when you drive along the road, you notice how there's an exposure or a cut of the soil, and just looking at it and noticing it. Because as soon as we notice it, then we can start to really see it everywhere in our daily life. And as soon as we notice it, we'll celebrate it in the sense that we'll be able to talk about it with others. So I think the first step is really seeing soil in your daily life and celebrating it that way with others.
Awesome. That's great. So what is a significant challenge you've had to overcome through your education or career?
Yeah, so science is fundamentally challenging, right? This idea that we're creating new knowledge and we're seeking to discover and seeking to create new knowledge, that's inherently difficult. And there have been a lot of times where I have just felt like I was doing it wrong, or, wasn't the right person to be doing this kind of job, wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough. I would say one of my biggest challenges really have been myself, and, standing in my own way and not being kind of confident in my ability to do the work. But that just takes practice and time and encouragement, I think, and the realization that science is for everybody. Everybody can do it. It is a way of coming to understand the world. And the same is true for soil science. Soil science is no different. Soils are for everyone, and soil science needs everyone for that same reason.
Love that. So have you noticed any ways your field could improve so that more women and people from diverse backgrounds feel welcome?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I mean, I think one of the things that we know about soil science is it is a traditionally very male dominated field, and that is changing, although we still see that there are distinct challenges in having diverse representation of voices within soil science. And so one of the things that I think is really important is doing things like this, being out in the public sphere and showing people what soil scientists look like. Because I think that when most of people think of a soil scientist, they either have never met a soil scientist for one, and they maybe don't expect somebody who looks like me, right? I don't really know. And so I think that piece is also really important, but also creating educational and institutional structures that really help women and people from historically marginalized communities come into this field and not just show up, but also really feel supported and included in this space. And I know that that's something that myself and many other soil scientists are seeing as utmost importance, not just right now, but really continuing on into the future. And so a lot of us are working on making soil science a more diverse and inclusive place. So there's progress that's being made, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Awesome. So if you could go back in time, what would you say to encourage your younger self when starting your STEM career?
I think I would tell young Yamina to keep following your curiosity, because you may not know where it's going to lead you, but it will never lead you astray. I think that that's something that is so important, to just not judge what you're most excited about and just keep going, keep following it. And as long as you're excited about the next step, then it's the right one.
Awesome. And our last question, any advice or words of encouragement for this next generation of STEM professionals?
Ooh, well, my answer is probably really similar. Like, just keep following that curiosity. What I say is, I would have never guessed that I could end up being a soil scientist, or that I would end up being a soil scientist, and really have fallen into this career that I could have never expected to have. And so my advice would be, don't limit yourself. Just keep going, and if anything seems exciting to you or interesting, just go for it. Don't worry about what everyone else thinks. Just, maybe you'll become a soil scientist, maybe not, but whatever you do, it's going to be awesome. And I'm looking forward to meeting you one day.
Love that. Yamina, thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, thanks for teaching us about soil, what and how we can celebrate it in real life, and looking around it every day. So
Yes.
yeah, we love it. So to our audience, thank you so much for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, and go out and find some